Hello, I'm Jim Gilligan, an assistant professor of English education at San Francisco State University, and a proud Boiler alum. Boiler up. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about queer issues in education and strategies for queer inclusion and queer pedagogy. I'm going to organize first let me get started by sharing my screen and showing you the Google slide presentation that I have prepared. All right, I'm going to organize my ideas and suggestions today within a framework that I hope is familiar to most of you. I often tell my pre-service teachers that their performance in the classroom is typically assessed according to three criteria: knowledge, skills, and disposition. Since one of the goals of my talk is to help you develop or improve your competency regarding queer issues in education, I will use these same three criteria to frame the information that I share with you. Whatever your level of familiarity with respect to queer issues in education, I'm hopeful that you'll find something of value and use in this presentation and perhaps in the live Q&A coming up at the end of the module. Now, I know this presentation will merely scratch the surface of all the information available about the LGBTQ community and queer issues in education. So I hope you will look for gaps in the information that I share here, especially if I neglect to mention something that you're curious about. Make note of anything that I leave out, and be ready to ask questions during the Q&A about anything that I've omitted or overlooked. So let's get started with the first dimension of competency regarding LGBTQ plus issues in education: knowledge. Now, I'm sure you understand that you can't teach what you don't know, and therefore a strong knowledge base regarding queer issues in education and the queer community in general can serve as the foundation for queering your teaching, right? So I'm going to start by discussing some terminology. Some of you might be wondering why I feel so comfortable using the word queer, which comes with a lot of cultural baggage attached. Though the word was most commonly used to mean strange, peculiar, or odd, it evolved into a derogatory term for gay men and lesbians, and in fact, anyone who did not appear to conform to social or cultural gender roles. The word queer has since been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community, especially the scholarly community, much like the pink triangle that was developed to be put on the uniforms of prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, and that pink triangle denoted suspected homosexuals, and that pink triangle is now used as a symbol of empowerment and pride in the queer community. So the same thing happened with the word queer. It's now used as an inclusive term that describes and empowers a broad range of individuals who do not identify as heterosexual or cisgender. In addition, queer is often used as a verb to describe the process of problematizing or questioning concepts or constructs such as gender and sexuality, which have historically been thought of as binaries. So rather than thinking of male and female as opposites, they are instead considered ends of a spectrum among which we can situate our gender identity. Right? So male and female, as opposed to male or female. gay and straight as opposed to gay or straight, much like the Kinsey scale. The Kinsey scale, a Kinsey 6 is someone who identifies as exclusively gay, Kinsey 0, Kinsey 1, exclusively straight, with, of course, gradations between for people whose sexuality does not necessarily correspond to one or the other. They're bisexual, occasionally curious. There are very few people who are exclusively one or the other, right? Now, you can use the word queer as a verb to kind of upset just about anything that's thought of as a binary construct. Arts and sciences, night and day. I often think of condominiums as queer real estate because it's an apartment that you own as you would own a house, right? So it's kind of an apartment and a house at the same time. The word queer is not, however, universally valued and used by everyone within the LGBTQ community, and some people still use it as an oppressive term. As with most terms that continue to transform with use, context is crucial. Who's using the term, who or what the term is being used to describe, and under what circumstances. All of those factors contribute to help determine the meaning of a term, the word, in this case, queer. Another frequently used term is the acronym LGBTQ or LGBTQ+. The term has also continued to grow as the queer community continues to include more folks. Like the term queer, there's no consensus regarding which letters and hence which communities, quote unquote, belong under this umbrella. The pluses here at the end indicate that yet more communities are part of the group. So there are, of course, many more words, terms, and idioms to know. Here are some resources you can consult to learn more of them. The Human Rights Campaign, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, both publish very useful glossaries and guides to terminology. There are websites that include the infographics you see here on the genderbread person and the flying gender unicorn, which you can use, of course, to explain the differences among all this terminology to your students, should you choose to include this in your teaching, right? Now, once you feel comfortable with queer terminology, you might be ready to either identify or add queer content to your curriculum or queer some of the content that's already there. Depending upon the subject that you teach, some of you will find this easier than others. It's a lot easier than you think, though, because once you are familiar with queer content and the practice of queering, you are likely to find it everywhere you look. It becomes almost inescapable, right? So before I begin discussing curricular issues, however, I do want to issue a disclaimer. Before including any queer content in your curriculum, please consider whether it is appropriate and acceptable within the standards of your grade level, school, and community. If you are unsure, please consult your department chair and/or administrators before querying your curriculum, just to be on the safe side. Let's start with subjects where queer content is a bit easier to find. English language arts, just about all languages for that matter, social studies, health and wellness, and the sciences, right, especially biology. So for example, in language arts, you can include texts, especially young adult texts, that feature queer characters or focus on issues of gender and sexuality. For example, the recent novel, The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, features a biracial protagonist who discovers his talent for drag. The text includes the added bonus of being queer in form as well as in content. It is a novel, but it is written entirely in poetic form. So it blurs the boundaries between those two forms of discourse, prose and poetry. Right? The novel Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn focuses on an asexual protagonist, Alice, who struggles to come out to her family and friends as both asexual and biromantic. Incidentally, both of these texts were chosen as required reading by students in my classes, which is one way to queer your teaching, but more on that in a little while. There are many online resources where you can find appropriate queer literature to include in your curriculum. I've listed here websites from the Lambda Literary Awards, a vendor called Abe Books, a website called Epic Reads, and the well-known Goodreads website. Now, if you teach world languages, it would certainly be appropriate to teach and learn about why some languages, for example, Spanish, Italian, French, the Romance languages, why they're gendered and others are not. Why do some inanimate objects that have absolutely nothing to do with gender, why are they considered masculine or feminine within the context of the language, right? You could explore how and why the practice of gendering language might be connected to other aspects of culture. In social studies, if you're teaching history, there's no end to the historical figures who might be considered queer, gay, or lesbian, even if they did not identify as such during the time when they lived. For example, the history.com website features a page on Baron Friedrich von Steuben, whom in the headline of their page call him the Revolutionary War hero who was openly gay, even though that term was not available to him. And during the time when he lived, the 18th century, the words gay and queer did not mean what they mean today. By most accounts, however, von Steuben was almost certainly same-sex attracted. Not only will studying von Steuben allow you to make your curriculum more inclusive, but it will also facilitate discussions about word usage, the meaning of words, and how language evolves, which would be an excellent topic for interdisciplinary instruction, yet another way to queer your teaching. Health and wellness classes are a natural fit for teaching and learning about gender and sexuality, again, within school and community guidelines. And biology class would certainly be an appropriate forum for learning about sex assigned at birth, genetics, especially intersex individuals who used to be referred to as hermaphrodites, and how biology affects gender identity and gender expression. Other subjects might at first present some challenges for including queer content, but with some thought and consideration, you can identify authentic ways to include it. For example, in math, word problems could be written to include queer individuals, along with other marginalized communities and issues relevant to the queer community, as the example on this slide shows. Pardon me. This word problem mentions Craig and his boyfriend. Or math could be relevant to the study the contributions of queer mathematicians such as Alan Turing, who was forced to undergo chemical sterilization by the British government after it was discovered that he was homosexual. This despite inventing a computer that was instrumental in breaking the code that helped the Allies win World War II. If you've seen the movie The Imitation Game, you might be familiar with his story. After the sentence of forced sterilization, he soon died by suicide as a result of the government-imposed punishment, thereby depriving the world of any potential progress or inventions he might have created. In the year 2009, 55 years after Turing's death, the British government issued a formal apology for their cruel and inhumane treatment of Turing. Um, Here is yet another opportunity for rich interdisciplinary teaching and learning, the intersections among government, politics, mathematics, science, and social cultural attitudes towards non-heteronormative individuals. If you do not feel prepared to include or examine queer content in your subject area, or you are uneasy doing so due to the climate in your school or community, you can still queer your pedagogy in ways that do not necessarily have overt connections to gender or sexuality. Some of you, in fact, might already be doing so. Let me explain. Now, I have already alluded to two techniques you can adopt as a way to queer your practice, allowing students to select texts or materials and interdisciplinary strategies. Remember, queering as a verb simply refers to problematizing or blurring a perceived distinction between allegedly binary opposites. For example, in terms of text selection, it does not necessarily have to be a matter of the teacher or the students selecting texts or content. I've had a considerable degree of success empowering students to select a significant portion of the required reading they do in my courses. You can do the same in a number of ways. You could institute a split between the percentage or number of texts you will choose and a percentage or number of texts the students will choose. Student selections can be further guided by allowing students either free rein to select texts of their choice with teacher approval, or students can select texts from a group of options or a list that you and your colleagues have curated. The important element here is that students have options within reason, of course. If your school or department prescribes to a more rigid or heavily prescribed curriculum, this, of course, is a lot more difficult to do. Now, affording students options in text selection is one way to queer your teaching by erasing that division of power, the power to choose the content that will be studied, erasing that division between student and teacher. Another way to achieve this is by differentiating instruction and assessment, which implicitly acknowledges the concept that all students do not learn the same way. Queering instruction and assessment can take many forms. For example, it might mean including more visual and audio elements in your lessons. It might also involve teaching students how to teach. After all, teaching is learning twice, right? And then giving them the responsibility to teach many lessons or give demonstrations rather than mere presentations, instead of students simply getting up in front of the classroom and lecturing or reading, sharing material. They would develop lessons that involve their peers in being actively engaged in learning. This technique also creates a community of learners. Both you and your students are always simultaneously teaching and learning from each other. Speaking of which, you can also explicitly share with your students what you learn from them. Students don't often realize that their teachers are fellow learners as well. And to show them that you are in fact a fellow learner, you can simply be very explicit about it with them and say at the end of a class or a lesson, here's what I learned from you today. Or at the end of a unit, here's what I learned from you. You can compare, contrast the unit if you've taught it before and say, well, last time I taught this unit, here's what happened. So this is how I changed. This is what I learned from that previous experience. And now this is how I've implemented it with you. And now here's what I've learned from doing it again. If you're currently pursuing graduate coursework or a graduate degree or engaged in professional development, such as these modules, you can let students know that you too spend a good deal of time reading material for texts, for courses, and completing assignments, just as they do. You can also differentiate your assessment, which can be done in a number of ways. You can add more constructed responses or short written responses if you tend to heavily rely on multiple choice or short answer questions in your assessment instruments. Also consider including creative assignments as an option for students to demonstrate their learning. And for those of you who have been wondering why I have a picture of Lin-Manuel Miranda on this slide, I'm going to tell you right now. The musical Hamilton is an excellent example of a creative response to a text. Lin-Manuel Miranda was inspired to write the musical Hamilton after he read Ron Chernow's massive biography of Alexander Hamilton. The play was Miranda's creative response to that text. Now, I'm not suggesting that you require your students to write a Broadway musical as a creative assessment of their learning, but you can certainly offer them creative options as one way to demonstrate their understanding. They can reformulate a text. They can dramatize an experiment in science. They can write poetry as a way of expressing what they've learned. There are many, many creative and interesting ways you can do this. Try some out. The musical Hamilton can also serve as an example of project-based assessment. And now, Miranda wrote the play and he originated the title role, but he certainly didn't do it all by himself. He didn't design the costumes, he didn't build the sets, he didn't play the instruments, he didn't arrange the choreography. He relied on the knowledge and skills of many, many others to create the production. You can likewise institute project-based assessments that require students to collaborate with peers as they build the differentiated knowledge and skills needed to complete a project. And the students themselves can choose the focus of that project if that's appropriate. Now, interdisciplinary teaching, which I have mentioned previously, is yet another way to queer your pedagogy. When you stop to think about it, some of the disciplinary divisions that exist in academia and that are probably represented by the various divisions and departments in your school, if you work in secondary education or higher, can be rather arbitrary. Is it possible to study biology without knowing anything about chemistry? Yet they're considered two different subjects. Where do you draw the line between literature and history? Hamilton is a perfect example, yes. What about the Declaration of Independence? Isn't that a work of both literature and history? Certainly a historical document. What about books like Things Fall Apart or Night by Elie Wiesel? Is that history? Is it literature? Memoir? Fiction? What about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech? Certainly a beautiful work of prose and the most frequently taught nonfiction text in secondary schools. But is that not also an important contribution to civil rights history, right? How do you categorize it? What about calculus? Is that math or physics or both, right? Teaching and learning in an interdisciplinary manner breaks down barriers and really foregrounds the importance of the material rather than saying it's either literature or history. It's either math or physics. It is both. And let's see how that, let's see how what we're studying makes it so, makes it this kind of blurred concept on the spectrum between these two alleged opposites or different subjects. Now, the dispositions that you choose to adopt are the last aspect of your teaching that I would like to talk about, right? The dispositions you choose to adopt regarding LGBTQ issues in education and the queer community, these are completely under your control. So I urge you to surpass mere tolerance for the LGBTQ community and instead develop an ethos of inclusion that supports and advocates for queer folks in your school and community. For example, as an overwhelming amount of research has shown, the single most effective deterrent to queer bullying in schools, especially in the upper grade levels, is teacher and administrator intervention and allyship. What that means is that recognizing and immediately addressing instances of queer bullying sends a clear message that your school community values respect for everyone and that you are a vocal and supportive member of, you're an ally, right? That you are a vocal and assertive, supportive supporter of queer students. So identifying and intervening in queer bullying is much like identifying and intervening in other types of bullying that you might witness, whether it occurs among students or among your colleagues. Because unfortunately, students aren't the only ones who engage in queer bullying. When you witness instances of queer bullying, swiftly intervene and identify it as bullying. This might be particularly difficult if the perpetrators are your colleagues. Sometimes our colleagues use inappropriate language to refer to students. And it might take a lot of courage to stop that colleague and say, hey, it's not okay to use that word to refer to a student. Simply addressing it and pointing it out is often powerful enough to change that other person's behavior. You might not change what that person believes, but getting a bully to change his or her behavior is a step in the right direction, right? There are, of course, obvious signs, right? Name calling, as I mentioned, physical assault, which are mostly targeted not necessarily at a student's actual sexual orientation, but more often at a student's perceived gender nonconformity. For an excellent empirical study on this, see C.J. Pascoe's book, Dude, You're a Fag, which I've included in the list of suggested reading that appears at the end of this slide deck. Another way to actively support the queer community is to acknowledge the presence and value of queer students, teachers, administrators, parents, and community members, as well as LGBTQ figures in the content your students are learning. One very simple way to do this is when you take attendance at the start of the semester or school year, rather than reading off each student's name, rather than doing the traditional roll call, allow students to identify themselves by their preferred names as you check names off your roster. Just go around the classroom and have each student identify themselves. If appropriate, you might also ask students to indicate their preferred pronouns, either aloud or on a roster sheet that you pass around class or allow students to access online. You can also seek out colleagues seek out allies among your colleagues and investigate what your school and your district is doing to support and celebrate queer students and faculty. If more needs to be done, challenge your school district leaders to be more vocal and visible in their support by forming a GSA, which now goes by the name of a Gender and Sexuality Alliance rather than a Gay Straight Alliance. Gender and sexuality are more inclusive terms. You can, if your school doesn't already have one, you can form a GSA and sponsor professional development opportunities for faculty and administrators based on LGBTQ inclusion, such as safe zone training. Or you can volunteer to spearhead these efforts yourself. To help you put these ideas and suggestions to use in the classroom, to increase your knowledge, practice your skills, and demonstrate your dispositions, I recommend that you engage in a process familiar to most teachers. In this case, you would be teaching yourself, right? So engaging in the teaching cycle of planning, facilitating, and asserting instruction First, you would identify the specific kinds of knowledge, skills, or dispositions that you want to adopt. Design a plan to practice them, try them out, and then reflect on how effective your efforts were. Modify as needed and repeat the process. Once you feel that you have achieved competence, begin working on a new bit of knowledge, new skills, or a new aspect of your disposition. If you're feeling that, wow, this is a lot to take in, how am I gonna incorporate all of this in my teaching? You don't have to. Pick one thing that you can do, one way to incorporate this. Get comfortable with that, and then add more as you feel comfortable. This is not something you can accomplish all in one fell swoop, right? Now, I'm not suggesting it will be easy, right? Effecting change takes guts and persistence. You'll also need to be comfortable with ambiguity, something that I myself continue to struggle with. Queering knowledge sometimes means queering the perceived distinctions between knowing and not knowing, between success and failure, between product and process, between learning and not learning. Perhaps we should not equate success and knowing with learning. If we value learning over the mere acquisition of knowledge, if we value learning over grades, and I presume we all do, shouldn't we value our students' failed attempts as an integral element of the learning process? Indeed, isn't failure necessary for learning? Most scientists will tell you they often learn more from their failed experiments than they do from their successful ones. We need to create learning environments where failure is expected and celebrated as part of the learning journey. The authors of Discipline with Dignity suggest that we redefine failure as not yet. If a student says, I don't know, or I can't, encourage the student to embrace the power of not yet. If a student says, I don't know, say, you don't know yet, but you will eventually. Student says, I can't do that yet. You can't do that yet. It implies that learning is a process. Learning is a goal. Learning is something to work toward, right? Unsuccessful efforts followed by reflection teach us which changes and modifications we need to make in order to succeed. We need to make our students comfortable somewhere along the spectrum of knowing and not knowing, trying and failing and trying again. In the wise words of Samuel Beckett, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you all at the Q&A. I'll share with you now my list of references and suggested reading. These online resources, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, Human Rights Campaign, Safe Zone Project, and Trevor Project, they all have abundant resources and information on their websites. Many of them are freely downloadable, shareable lesson plans and units applicable to a wide variety of disciplines that can be adapted for many, many purposes. I encourage you to check them out, investigate them, see what will be useful for you, take it, share it, try it out. Here is all of my contact information. My email address is here down at the bottom right. I welcome anyone to email me with ideas, questions, suggestions, advice, whether you're seeking or giving. I'm happy to engage in dialogue. Now, I will end the presentation, and I hope to see you all soon.